Welcome to the Automation World Get Your Questions Answered podcast, where we connect with industry experts to get the answers you need about industrial automation technologies. I'm David Greenfield, Director of Content for Automation World, and the question we'll be answering in this episode is, what is a machine risk assessment? Joining me to answer this question is Devin Murray from Schmersal, a supplier of safety switchgear devices and systems for personal and machine protection. And Devin works specifically in Schmersal's Tec.nicum Engineering Services division, which focuses on machine safety such as risk assessments, validations, and training. So thanks for joining me today, Devin.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, let's get right to the question at hand, Devin. Just what is a machine risk assessment?
Sure thing. Essentially, a machine risk assessment is a systematic approach to identify reasonably foreseeable hazards. And I want to emphasize those words, right? Reasonable foreseeable hazards to evaluate and quantify the risks associated with those hazards, and then also to provide a solution to eliminate or minimize exposure to those hazards, and essentially also re-evaluating to make sure that all hazards have been addressed and guarded to an acceptable level. But with that, right, I want to just take a quick second and go over a misconception with the idea of a risk assessment, right? Because a lot of times I have the discussion where we look at a machine and we identify the hazards and identify the risks, and some think that that itself is the risk assessment, where it's not. Right, that's the first part. Right, the first part is identifying those reasonable foreseeable hazards. That's actually the risk analysis, right? Identifying those hazards and the risks, and then finding that solution to help minimize or again eliminate those hazards and risks. That overall process is the machine risk assessment.
Okay, thanks for clarifying those aspects of that. So, are these machine risk assessments are they required for manufacturers?
Well, to answer that, I want to focus on OSHA, right? Because OSHA, as we all know, that's the law of the land here in the United States. And as you know, they have the Occupational Safety and Health Act that was established in 1970, right? And with that, there's the General Duty Clause, and under Regulation 29 CFR 1910, it states that the employer shall provide a workplace free of recognized hazards, right? Shall. And if we know anything from standards, when we see shall, that means that we have to do it, right? So OSHA says we have to provide a workplace free of recognized hazards. And if we, dig deeper into this act and we look at CFR 1910.212, which is the requirements for all machines, they start off, or that regulation starts off by stating that hazards shall be guarded. Right. So again, we have that shall statement. Um, and if we go back to what a risk assessment is, it's identifying hazards as OSHA says we shall do, and it's guarding those hazards as OSHA says we shall do. So when we look at those requirements from OSHA, yes, right, a risk assessment is required. Um, the actual process and what it looks like, that's completely up to you. There's regulations and standards in the industry that you can use as guidance, but the actual the process itself, that is required.
Yeah, there's not a lot of gray area with a word like shall. It's definitely not should.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah. So, based on the OSHA regulations you were mentioning there, it sounds like all equipment in a manufacturing or a processing plant does require a risk assessment. Is that a correct assumption, or is it just certain types of equipment that fall within the scope of a machine risk assessment?
Yeah, sure. So even with that, I want to again go back to OSHA, right? Because again, they're the law of the land, right? And OSHA gives us the definition of a machine, and they state that there are three fundamental areas: the point of operation, the power transmission device, and the operating controls. And if you look at your equipment, and if it has these three fundamental areas, then that's a machine, and that would fall under the machine risk assessment. And if you look at some other standards like an ISO 12100, for example, or even ANSI, B11.0, they give you definitions of a machine as well, and they have that same fundamental definition for those three areas, and then they elaborate a little more. But again, you have a definition of a machine. So if it falls within this definition, that's going to require a machine risk assessment. Now, in saying that, though, there are going to be some machines that require a more in-depth evaluation. There may be some machines that may not have or may not pose any significant injuries. Well, we can document that, right? You can document that and say, okay, this machine was assessed on this date by these individuals, and it was concluded that there were no, reasonably foreseeable hazards to take into consideration. But in order to get to that point, you have to first assess it, right? So any machine, like, you have to do a risk assessment on for sure.
So we've been talking about machine risk assessments and the OSHA regulation at a pretty high general level, but
Mhm.
drilling in a little more specifically, what about machines that are designed to be inherently safe, like a collaborative robot, for example? Does the OSHA regulation around machine risk assessment apply to them too?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely for sure. And I mean, if you go back to that general duty clause, right, it states that the employee shall make sure that you have a safe working environment. So that includes collaborative robots as well. And again, I look at a misconception with collaborative robots because, like you said, they're designed to be inherently safe. So a lot of times I've seen situations where a end user would buy a collaborative robot, right? Inside the manuals, it says it meets these standards. It says it's inherently safe. So they buy it, they purchase it, they plop it into the application, and they automatically assume that it's safe, right? And that's not the case. When you look at these standards surrounding collaborative robots, such as ISO TS 15066 and ISO 10218, and bring it back home, ANSI R 15.06, they all state a risk assessment shall be carried out. Right? Again, that shall statement, and that's really because the collaborative robot can be used in an application that's unsafe, right? So if you're using a collaborative robot in its true collaborative form, where it's in the same working envelope as the operator, and that collaborative robot that's been designed to be inherently safe is now, moving a part that's 400 degrees Fahrenheit, well, that's a hazard, right? And we have to do an assessment to identify that hazard. So yes, even collateral robots or equipment that's been designed to be inherently safe, we still have to assess those in the environment.
So, since there's clearly no escaping the regulation, as you've made very clear here, you know,
All right.
how are the completed risk assessments that shall be performed? How are those filed and recorded in order to be in compliance?
Yeah, so again, the process for the risk assessment, it's completely up to you. Right? How do you want to go about doing it? What are going to be your parameters for the risk? What are you using for that arbitrary quantitative number, that HRN number, that hazard rating number, right? That's completely up to you, right? But whatever you use, you want to make sure that it's standardized throughout the company and throughout your site, right? You want to make sure that you have something that you can use for the machines for your company or for your site. So you want to make sure that it makes sense, right? Because you cannot take the principles and concepts surrounding a CNC lathe, right? And then try to apply them to a printing press,
Mhm.
right? So you want to make sure that you have something that standardizes and that makes sense for your company, and to show that you are doing your due diligence again to fulfill that general duty clause.
Okay. So, since this is something that, again, we'll hit on the shall thing that shall be performed, but it's fairly wide open as to how it's done. There's not a lot of, as you said, there's not a lot of specific guidelines about how you go about it or how you record it, but who is ultimately responsible for the machine risk assessment in a typical manufacturing or processing facility?
Yeah, so again, according to OSHA, is the employer, right? So the employer is responsible for the safe working environment for this machine. However, if you look into ANSI B11, which is a recognized relevant safety standard, ANSI B11.0 specifically, that calls out requirements for both the supplier or the machine builder, and the end user. So we'll see that there's requirements for both the OEM and the end user to conduct this risk assessment. And you'll also see inside ANSI 11.0 that up until the actual installation, there's potential for the OEM and the end user to collaborate on the risk assessment. As far as like the individual people, like who should be part of the risk assessment team, like you said, going back to the manufacturing side, you want to have people that know the machine, right? So definitely operators, maintenance personnel. You want to have management there, right? Management may not use the machine, but safety should be driven from the top down if you want to have a true safety culture, right? So they should be part of the assessment team as well as EHS personnel. So it's definitely a team effort. Um, but yeah, that's who should be a part of it. And again, the OEM has a part of it for the risk assessment as well as the end user.
Okay. So now that we know who, let's get to the where. Where do you recommend that manufacturers, start with the risk assessment process?
Yeah, so again, you want to start by finding something that, as a manufacturer, you can standardize on, right? So you want to see if there's a Type C standard that's out there that applies to your machine. And I guess I should explain what a Type C standard is. So a safety standard can be broken up into four types. There's a Type A standard, which is for general safety. So I've been referring back to ANSI B11.0, right? That's for safety of machinery. That's real general. That's a Type A standard. Then there's a Type B1 standard, which is for certain aspects of safety, such as ISO 13849, for example, that looks at the safety functions of the machine. That's a certain aspect of safety. Then there's also a B2 standard, which looks at the requirements for a safety device, such as ISO 13850. That's requirement for an e-stop. And then there's a Type C standard that looks at a specific machine, right? So if you're a manufacturer of, CNC lathes, then you want to look at, for example, ANSI B11.22, right? Or if you are making robots and robot cells, then there's that anti RA 1506. So you want to start with that, right? See what Type C standards apply to your machine, because that's going to give you some guidance on those reasonable foreseeable hazards that you want to take into consideration for your risk assessment.
So, one last question, Devin. We've
Mhm.
covered in our conversation, we've covered the what, the who, and the where, so to speak. So let's hit the when. When should the risk assessment process actually start?
Perfect. Good question. So honestly, the sooner the better, right? So the risk assessment should begin early in the concepts of designs. And when you look at the hierarchy of machine safety, you first want to see if you can design the hazard out, right? And if you can't design it out, then you move on to, okay, can we substitute the hazard for something less dangerous, or can we provide some type of control measure like hard guards or safety light curtains, for example, right? But the first thing is, can we design it out? Right? So if we are, having this assessment process started during the design conversation, then we can identify these hazards and try our best to design them out, or make them even less hazardous. So the earlier the better. And again, going back to anti B11.0, they state in there too that the assessment should begin as early as possible, and then updated and validated as the design matures. So there should be milestones in place where you are revisiting the hazards and risks of that machine as you continue that design process up until installation.
Well, thank you for joining me for this podcast, Devin. I really appreciate it. And thanks, of course, to all of our listeners. And please keep watching this space for more installments of Automation World Get Your Questions Answered. And remember, you can find us online at automationworld.com to stay on top of the latest industrial automation technology insights, trends, and news.